So great. So we've just completed your first TheraQ assessment. Let's have a look at what's underneath. So when you click the View Analysis button, in about a couple of seconds, you'll see, the report.
Whoa, holy fuck. Oh my god, it's a lot of red.
So don't fret. Let's walk through this together.
Okay.
We can kind of make sense of this part. I'm just gonna stop recording because I can't record and talk at the same time.
Can I record this?
You can, yeah.
Because this is my important to know.
Well, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the first things that we know, so before we get really hot and heavy into it, just a bit of methodology.
Oh my god, my peak alpha is so bad.
Yeah, so let's just kind of walk through all this because we don't want to interpret anything out of context, right? So what we do is we look at the occipital, the default mode network first, right? And then we'll work our way from back to middle to front. The reason we do this is because default mode typically associates with some of the most powerful emotions or emotional regulation feelings that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and hence the name default mode. It's very deep. And then we'll work our way through to the central, which is emotional regulation, attention, and things like that. And then the frontal is, of course, cognitive performance and cognitive capability. So let's look at what this is showing us. So the first thing that jumps out at is when your eyes are closed compared to your eyes open, your additional alpha produced during eyes closed is below 50%. So that typically is a significant indicator of a lot of stress and a lot of thoughts and intrusive thoughts going through your mind, okay?
There are, yes. It actually happened.
Yeah, so when we close our eyes in a normal, quote-unquote, clinically unremarkable state, I'll refrain from the use of the word normal because I don't think there's anything such as normal. But let's say in a non-intrusive state where you can operate fairly free of these stress, typically when we observe this is when your eyes closed, you're producing at least 50 to 70% additional alpha from your default mode network. And this is because evolutionarily speaking, when we close our eyes, our occipital lobe stops processing visual information. It goes back into sort of this default mode where it's waiting on standby, it's ready to shift, and it's ready to go sort of embrace the next challenge. The lack of additional alpha produced here can be a very significant indicator of stress that individual is experiencing or suffering from the time point, right? So this is something that we can change, of course. Most every part of the brain and the behavior can be changed.
Alpha shift.
So alpha shift again means, from your eyes open to eyes closed state, how much additional alpha does your brain produce in the back part of your brain?
When eyes are open?
When you shift from eyes open to eyes closed.
Oh, because eyes closed produce more alpha. Because eyes inhibit alpha.
Correct.
And alpha is an indication, the more alpha is produced, if you're stressed.
No.
Or less alpha.
So insufficient alpha production during eyes closed phase compared to eyes open is an indicator of stress.
Yes, low alpha.
So if you're producing more alpha, then
theta. Oh, my theta is...
Yeah, your theta is, so the other thing we're going to look at
my peak alpha is so low. My alpha waves are so slow.
Yeah, so you have, I've been watching your raw brainwave as you're kind of going through the exercise. You seem to have what's called low alpha slow. So that's lower amplitude alpha, a slower register. So when you look at the Fourier transform, your alpha peak seems to be concentrated at around 7 hertz. That's actually in the theta range. That's not in the alpha range.
Is it ADHD?
Well, it's hard to conclude a diagnosis based on a single metric, obviously, but this is a sign that your default mode network can be functioning at a level that makes it difficult for you to focus because there's so much slow waves and where the slow waves concentrated, right? So a healthy amount of PDR or peak alpha should be at least around 9.5. So possible reasons why individuals can present lower peak alpha include things like prescription drug use, narcotic use.
Can it be lower than 7? Is the software designed to detect this?
Well, It can be.
So it might be lower than 7. We don't know.
So actually, if you look at the Fourier, which is why we include the full Fourier, which is the full picture here. So our software starts with a measurement range of 1 hertz all the way up to 45. So this is actually where your peak slow wave frequency is concentrated around 7.
Holy shit! I have so much slow wave on under task.
You do. Yeah, you do.
Holy shit!
That's the other thing. Good observation. So now look here. We break this down a little bit more discreetly. So when you look at, how your delta behaves, which is the slowest of all frequency spectrums, related to usually sleepiness or falling asleep. What happened here is that during your eyes closed, your delta actually dropped. Your eyes open have 20% more or 25% more delta than your eyes closed. Now, watch what happens here between eyes closed and under task. So your under task presents 50% more delta compared to eyes closed.
Holy
That's
shit.
a sign of sleep dysregulation. So you've probably had inadequate quality sleep over the last couple of days.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So that's a huge marker here. So
that's a huge marker. Wow.
What happens with brains is when we close our eyes, if we're not sleep deficient, right, it's going to generate more delta and theta. So theta is behaving correctly, but delta is behaving somewhat out of ordinary. So what that tells us is that there's a sleep dysregulation underlying the delta production during task. So when you went into task state, when you started doing the subtraction, you kind of zoned out and your brain is kind of pulling you to a sleepier state. Does this sound
What's making brain into sleepier state?
Yeah. When under work task or under load. So that's what that tells us. Okay. So nothing else worth of additional attention. Your alpha is really low, so that could be associated with sleep, with stress, with just having a very busy brain.
Okay.
And another possibility of that is potential trauma, stress.
Yes, I have a lot of trauma.
Brain, traumatic brain injury.
Really, trauma causes alpha.
Well, remember
lower alpha. Alpha. Well, brain can when you have too much PTSD, it suppresses alpha.
It does. Yeah.
What about peak alpha? There's alpha amplitude.
Yeah. So amplitude is this. The amplitude is what we use to measure the additional alpha. This is, remember, a comparison between eyes open and eyes closed. Right? We don't have the absolute here, but when you compare the amount of alpha your occipital lobe produces during an eyes open phase to an eyes closed phase. Again, that eyes closed phase should generate at least 50% more alpha in comparison to that of eyes open.
Okay.
The inability to generate this additional alpha could signify that when you close your eyes, you're not feeling sort of inwardly focused, kind of internally focused state. Rather, there's a lot of thoughts coming through your brain, sort of like hippocampal area or amygdala is overactivated, right? So our amygdala is just right about where that O1 is.
Can you detect it? Does it affect alpha?
I'm sorry?
Does amygdala overactivation affect alpha?
It does, 100%.
Wow.
So think of amygdala as your fire alarm.
Yeah,
so it's like, what this is like? This is like sitting
in
in
the occipital, because is amygdala connected to the occipital lobe most?
It's close to where the occipital is.
So EO measures it more than EC.
Well, not quite. EO is just eyes open.
Okay.
EC is eyes closed. So these are just shorthand. So what's really happening here is when you close your eyes, your occipital lobe is still showing not much more alpha. That means your amygdala is going off nonstop. So that's actually sending a fire alarm signal through your head. Okay, so you know what that's like? That's like sitting in an office where the fire alarm randomly goes off every 5 minutes. And of course, you can't get a lot done because, well, how could you? You're getting interrupted by random fire alarm sounds going beep, 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 beep. Nobody can get any work done that way, right? So it's a way that your brain is kind of regulating what is sensed as environmental threat or danger.
Yeah.
So
I have a lot of environmental threat and danger, it seems.
Right. Folks that suffer from low alpha in the occipital lobe typically have some sort of history of trauma and stress, which seems like that's the case here based on a presenting marker. Okay, coupled with low peak alpha, this means that thread or the trauma has dug in and then really impacted how your occipital lobe processes information. So you can understand peak alpha and back is kind of the clock speed of your default mode, right? So low clock speed could be
Rumination, more rumination.
or
Oh my God.
overactivation. So I don't want you to worry too much. This is not a diagnosis, nor is it a prognosis. It's just I'm explaining what I'm seeing here. Now, everything else seems kind of, so yeah, you've got a lot of theta beta ratio.
Yeah, that's
a lot of
ADHD.
theta. Yeah, so high theta beta ratio is typically a marker for ADHD. You're quite correct.
Yeah.
But where you look at that is not quite in the back. So this is a good time to move to a central. Okay, so let's look at your salience network or your cingulate. So we're now looking at CZ. Okay, so that's the one smack down in the center. So your alpha raise is comparably better in the CZ, so that's good, and alpha flexibility is good. And your theta beta ratio again is a little higher. That's in a red zone. So again, when you look at the Fourier, it's very clear why you've got a crap ton of theta here compared to mid beta, which is sort of the healthy. So let me kind of just review what these are. Theta is kind of a mind wandering, kind of like a hyper-associative, free-associative kind of frequency.
This is all center, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, we're looking at center now. So when you look at how much theta you have, right, compared to proportionate mid-beta, that's a lot of theta. So what that indicates is sometimes you could feel, right, it's hard to rein your brain in to sort of apply cognitive processes around free random thoughts that are intruding or kind of coming into your brain. So you kind of follow those thoughts and without the ability to necessarily stay focused on one task at a time. Does that sound about? Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah. Okay. So the high theta beta ratio is indicative of that. So when you look at the DSM universe and the diagnosis universe that typically speaks to behavior that are sort of related to ADHD, like again, I'm not diagnosing you, I'm not a qualified psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, but we see a lot of folks with high theta beta ratio, particularly high theta and insufficient beta, presenting ADHD behavior, right? So, so that's that. Okay, so nothing else noteworthy here. So this is, again, the reason why we start from posterior and move towards cingulate and then ultimately anterior is because
Cingulate is central?
Cingulate is central, yes, the neurological word for the center part. So the reason why we move from back to front, again, is back is powerful. It's dominating, a lot of the central and frontal behavior, right? So, when you have somebody, for example, that has multiple expressions, let's say ADHD, anxiety, and trauma, it's hard to sort of pick which one do I start training, which one do I start tackling first, right? So the general rule of thumb in this case is you always tackle the most significant underlying issue because, let's say you have something going on in the front, and if I start training your front without addressing or looking at what your back is saying, a lot of that work on the front will be useless because the back will just override it in time. So you're kind of covering the symptom, not the cause, right? So moving on. So the big takeaway here on the cingulate is the high theta beta ratio, again, predicated by the abnormal amount of theta that you're exhibiting, which is related to mind wandering. And let's look at your front. Okay, so you've got quite a bit of theta in the front as well, but wow, this is off the charts. Okay,
What's off the charts? Wait, delta?
Delta, yeah.
Damn
So
it.
you're very sleepy.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to worry, Alex. So this is not a diagnosis. You're not in trouble here. Okay, so this is just kind of a under the hood peak of what your brain is telling us at this very specific point in time, right? So you may have had a long day of flying, or you may have had terrible sleep or jet lag, or what have you. That all could present in insufficient quality sleep. So again, you can see your frontal peak rhythm is focused on 7 hertz. So that's relatively lower, but also the key thing here is a significant amount of delta on the frontal left, which is F3 here. So that really inhibits any kind of activity, right? Cognitive activity. Delta is a very inhibitory frequency. What that is sleep, okay? We measure a lot of delta when somebody's asleep, and we measure a lot of theta when they just wake up, but they're not fully awake. They're kind of like between that sleep and awake stage. That's theta, and everything else is sort of like conscious cognitive frequencies, right? So again, just looking at this, you've got a lot of theta, and just a lot of theta in the front that could be inhibitory. Right?
Inhibitory?
So you're inhibitory in terms of like cognitive power. Like your frontal cortex doesn't seem to be able to crank out the cognitive power, which is usually signified by low beta and mid beta here. That's very suppressed and compared to delta and theta.
Oh, because low and beta and mid beta are cognitive power, basically.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. So mathematically speaking, it's squeezing out your cognitive frequencies, right? So one of the things that we typically look at for these kind of expressions is, can we start inhibiting, bringing down some of the slow waves in the front and start simultaneously improving low beta in a sort of F3, F4 region, so prefrontal cortex or frontal cortex. So that in turn, cranks up the cognitive power to be able to boost start the cognitive engine of the brain, right? So again, very, very consistent to the rest of the reading. Symmetry-wise, you're not too bad. Alpha symmetry is good. Why we look at symmetry, slop-sided alpha symmetry usually can be a big marker for depression, right? So a little bit of neuroscience between the left and right frontal cortex. The left frontal cortex serves to mediate positive emotional responses, where the right frontal cortex serves to mediate negative emotional responses.
Wow.
The disbalance of alpha filter between the two typically suggests, or rather is correlated to the inability to mediate one set of emotion versus another. So you see that in major depressive disorder quite a bit. But your balance is actually quite okay. So nothing is really kind of screaming out at us. I mean, the most disbalanced metric is you have beta asymmetry. So your beta is more powerful. So beta again is that cognitive power, frequency, right? So what this says to me, because you're right high, on a beta, is that you're much more of a divergent thinker. So free association, big ideas, kind of like piecing things together out of the cloud. Then you are a convergent thinker, which are someone that excels at executing linear tasks. Planning something and following through a step at a time. So, this is probably the most relevant of all these markers, because everything else looks fairly okay. I mean, this isn't yellow zone, but it's not so far out of the green that warrants any kind of concern. So this is your raw neurometrics. So we just went through like your 23 neurometrics very, very quickly and highlighted some of the areas of concern. Do you have any questions?
Wow, that's so interesting.
Right.
There's central coherence.
Right, so we do not measure coherence.
Whoa, holy shit.
So we do measure the ipsative power distribution between four sites on every frequency register that your brain demonstrated in terms of brain waves. So you can see, as we kind of walk through, you've got a lot of delta on your frontal cortex.
Oh my God.
Especially on the frontal left here, you see that glaring red marks here. So this is why you could be feeling as of late that it's hard to focus, it's hard to concentrate and execute linear tasks. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
So that's associated with heavy inhibition on the delta spectrum on the frontal cortex. Now, because the other thing you've got going on here is you've got excessive high beta in the singular. So 25% start leaning towards excessive. That means there's quite a bit of rumination and overvigilance.
Holy shit. Really high beta, wow.
Yeah, so high beta is a ruminatory kind of...
Wow, low beta and mid beta are the working frequencies of beta then.
Well, no, so low beta you actually want, because that's a healthy...
Control.
Yeah, that's control, that's cognitive capability, cognitive performance, right? So you want to increase your low beta and C. You don't really quite have a lot of low beta going on here. Most of your low beta is concentrated on the frontal right. So that means when you're working, it's it's demonstrated in the divergent part of your cognitive faculty, right? So you're a good divergent thinker, not so much of a convergent thinker. See that -4 there? So divergent, convergent, right, left. Okay, so that's how we read it in a nutshell. Your presenting symptom seems to be your cingulate is suffering from high theta, which is very kind of a spacey frequency or register. So you could present as spacey and rather, someone that like can regulate their emotions quite effectively. That seems to be a challenge here, right? Does that correlate to how you feel?
To what? The challenge?
The challenge is to regulate your thought patterns.
Yeah, it's hard for me to do it. Really hard.
So a lot of theta. So
Theta's hard to regulate.
yeah, theta is very hard to regulate. So we have to look at theta in relation of things like alpha, because you have low, slow alpha. Yeah, so your emotional dysregulation
Holy
index
shit.
is quite. It's a 4.5 out of 10, so it's up there. And sleep is 3.6, but your sleep is quite significantly disrupted, it seems.
Yeah. Holy shit.
Cognitively, you're okay with divergent, but there's lots of red here with the convergent thinking, so quite a few. And stress, you're quite high. You're a 5 out of 10. So actually, I would even rate this a bit higher. So you seem pretty stressed out and be suffering from some sort of traumatic history.
Really? Just by talking to me?
I'm sorry?
Just by talking to me?
No, just by looking at your brainwaves.
Oh, holy
Actually, I
fuck.
don't really need to talk to you to understand all this. It's
my
all just your
God.
brainwaves suggesting. Now, it's always important for us to advocate that our clinicians and therapists confirm these sort of underlying, we call this latent markers, they're latent traits, because you don't have to talk to the patient to find out what's going on. But we always advocate that you confirm these latent traits with querying express traits. That's how the person's actually feeling, such as what I've just done. So when you confirm these things are actually challenges that are inhibiting the individual from living a fully active, fulfilled life, that's when you start formulating protocols to potentially start training them towards the right direction, right? So because of trauma history, we want to be extremely careful with the back brains. So it's very tempting to say, well, you've got insufficient alpha in the back, and that's really a lot of your problems stem from, and therefore we're going to pump your back brain full of alpha. In your case, that would actually cause you to abreact, because with traumatic history, you want to be really careful with alpha and theta, especially increasing the slower waves, because the slower waves can be really dissociative, and then once we kind of put those filters in there and start turning things off, emotions can flood the salience network and center executive network in a way that individuals may or may not be prepared to deal with. So instead, a safer way to go about this would be to pick something that starts inhibiting theta in the cingulate. So cingulate is a safer way to go. So we have a whole suite of protocols crafted by Dr. Brown, so the person we spoke with in Seattle. He's going to be at APA with us. So this is a set of his protocols, okay? So one of the things that I would, if you were my patient, I would recommend is something called poise. Excuse me, I'm just going to decline this. So something I would recommend is called poise, and why that is I think starting to improve the stress-related symptoms will ultimately serve to improve attention, concentration, emotional regulation. So I think, in other words, your dysregulation seems to be more limbically related, right? So when the amygdala goes off, you get spacey,
And sleep.
and you can't sleep because there's lots of thoughts just free flowing into your brain, right? So we got to start throttling that down before we do anything else, right? So the right site for you would be the cingulate, right? Because the cingulate, I think of it as kind of a router, it's sort of like a taskmaster kind of thing. So it tells the rest of the brain, hey, do I process this? Do I background it? Do I let it take up resource basically at any given point in time, right? So dysregulation in the cingulate could cause total and utter chaos in your brain because you start processing everything. Not before long, you run out of resource, right? So that seems to be the first presenting issue that we can start addressing. So what I would do if I were your provider is I would pick something that targets the cingulate called the poise protocol. So I'll expand that a little bit just because you seem like the curious kind that wants to know what and why and how. So one of the things that we will do on this protocol is we will start suppressing your high beta, that's overvigilance, right? Remember that high beta? We're going to bring that down a little bit. So what that does is it actually quenches your brain and slows it down a little bit, so you're not kind of spinning out like out of control with every thought that comes in. At the same time, we will also inhibit your theta, because there's too much theta all around, especially around the cingulate. So bringing that theta down can make you feel a bit more clear-minded and less foggy and less kind of just, squirrel brain, right? So we call that squirrel brain. And then finally, we're going to try to teach your brain how to produce more healthy low beta. And low beta, again, as we talked about, is really this sort of robust cognitive performance rhythm, right? So when you're, firing around 12 to 15 hertz in that low beta range, your brain is really kind of streamlining thoughts. It's processing information. It's doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing. So that would be like one protocol that I would train you with. I don't know what Dr. Hill's told you about in terms of your brain types and what would be better training, but this is quite an effective protocol that we start folks with that are fairly challenging in terms of regulating free-flowing anxiety, free-flowing thoughts, and trying to regulate their brain enough to achieve this kind of calm focus. So that's it. Yeah. So I'll send this over to you in your email. So
can you save my results?
I'm sorry.
Save my results.
Save your results.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
Awesome.
So I hope you found that